Community Shares Manager from Crowdfunder, and we're also joined by Dave Boyle from the Community Shares company today, and we're here to talk about community shares, but primarily related to energy projects. We decided it'd be most beneficial to just answer people's questions rather than to run through a long PowerPoint or anything like that. We wanted to make sure we answered your questions, so we will be emailing a link to a presentation that gives the basics of community shares. But I think we've got some questions coming in, but it might be worth just me handing over to Dave to give just a brief introduction and perhaps highlight some of the key points related to community shares.
Hi everybody. As Mark said, I'm Dave Boyle. I run the Community Shares company, and we're the official partners of Crowdfunder for doing community share issues. So Crowdfunder have got a great platform for undertaking your offer, for raising the money, promoting it and managing the transactions. But as those of you working in community energy will know, there's a whole lot of stuff which needs to be done before you get to the stage of saying to your community, we now need your money to invest. So some of those are very specific to the community energy sector. They're often related to regulatory issues and the way in which various government incentives do or don't work in relation to your financial management of your energy project. Many of the issues are common to all community share issues, regardless of whether that's in a community pub, community energy, a football club, or whatever it might be. So we're sure that some of the questions you'll have will relate more towards the technical aspects, and they'll probably be more in Mark's area of expertise, and the community shares sort of legal side of things I'll be covering off. But we're not really sure at what stage different groups are at. So what we didn't want to do is to give you a big pseudo lecture about what you need to do in order to do a community share issue, because we kind of assumed that many of you knew the basics, so we didn't need to do community shares 101, though as Mark says, we will be sending out a link to a presentation which is community shares 101, but we thought we'd work on the basis that you all had a bit of knowledge, and this was about exploring the questions you'd run into as you develop your knowledge.
So I think what we'll look to do is start straight in on a few questions. It's worth me just saying that there's lots of resources out there. On the Crowdfunder website itself, we have a community shares section which answers some of the basic questions around eligibility and the stages of setting up your offer. And we're keen to help through our partnership with Dave. We can help you through all aspects of it. One of the key areas that many groups are struggling with at the moment is around the engagement and marketing, and we're really keen to work with people on that aspect of it. So I think, Dave, we've got what's probably quite a common question, and certainly one for you, is just, although, as we say, we've got a webinar around it, someone's just asked about what's the basic process that they need to be aware of if they're at the start of setting up the share offer.
Well, aside from there's two aspects really. There's the operational side in terms of having your business plan developed and all the financial projections, which demonstrate both that the money you're seeking to raise will be commensurate with what you need the capital for. So in other words, that you've done your sums properly, and that the aspirations you have for enabling your investors to withdraw their money either with or without interest has been done. So there's all this sort of operational side, and if you're going to be going for some kind of accreditation for things like the Renewable Heat Initiative, there's that process as well, which will be specific to your specific enterprise. But from practical terms, the share offer side of it is to get the right legal structure, which would either be a cooperative society, though that's unlikely unless you're involved in the area of heat generation, where you can sell the energy direct to your members. So it's more likely to be a community benefit society. That's something which will be registered with the Financial Conduct Authority and would need to be about 3 to 4 weeks from submitting the paperwork. On top of that, you'll also need a bank account to be opened, which will take around about 1 month, because you'll need a bank account in order to receive the money you get from your investors. And that will be the case whether you get money through a platform like Crowdfunder, or you get people to give you checks or make bank transfers. Though we might come on to that, though we wouldn't advise doing it through that route for a number of reasons. So there's the legal side of things, and then there's the operational side. But the biggest thing, as Mark said, is to do the engagement work. If you think about your share offering in terms of concentric rings, like an archery target, the center of it will be you and your close friends and colleagues. There might be people who work with you in transition town initiatives or something similar. They're the true believers. They believe in community energy. They believe in practical action in the here and now to make a carbon-free future. All these people are so on board. They're gagging to give you their £250, their £500. And when you launch your offer, these are the people who flock to it very quickly and give you a sense that this is really motoring. What we often find is that when you move on to the next ring out of your archery target, that's where it gets a bit more difficult. Then you're speaking to people who aren't what you would class as true believers. They're not making community energy and indeed a carbon-free future the centerpiece of their activism. They might not even be activists at all. And we find sometimes that groups have spent so long doing the operational work, getting the regulatory stuff sorted, getting any tax breaks they might be able to access sorted, that they've just stopped talking to what you might call ordinary people who are not as into it as they are. And there gets to be a disconnect in terms of communication. So what you need to be doing when you get to the stage of launching your offer is to be converting people who are already on board. The period running up to the offer is where you get them on board. The Australians have a phrase which they use in politics called "you can't fatten a pig on market day." And I think quite a few share offers try and fatten the pig on market day by saying, "Hey everybody, we've got this share offer. It'll be dead good if we raise the money. Would you like to give us the money to help us move things forward?" And they realize they've not done enough engagement with their community, and it's not been deep enough, and it's not been wide enough. And they've satisfied themselves that they've been able to get engagement because they send out an email to 1,000 people and they get 20 people who they've known for years come back and say, "This looks really exciting." And there is a sort of disconnect you can have, and that bodes ill for any share issue you do. So that's the strongest piece of advice we can give, really, is not to neglect the engagement, because ultimately at the heart of it, if your offer is to succeed, it succeeds because enough people put enough money into your enterprise, and they do that because they feel they can trust you, they know everything there is to know about this project, and they're aware of the risks, and they're going to push on through them. And that doesn't come easily, and I think it's a common problem to crowdfunding in general. It feels like once you've put it on a website, sent an email out to people, maybe put it on Facebook, your job's done, and you sit back and watch the money flow in. And sadly, you know, the bad news is what you raise is a function of how much work you've put into raising it. And that's I think there's, you know, as important as getting the engineering and the technical side to your energy project right is getting the engagement side to your project right.
Yeah, and I think that's quite true of energy products in particular. Is all the work you go into to get your planning application, all that's really timely in terms of enabling you to generate the interest around your share offer, giving the local people the right to, or the opportunity rather, to be able to buy into what you're doing is great. It's worth pointing out as well that you should add in your email, you can ask questions through Twitter, and the more that come through, we obviously work our way through them. You can use the hashtag CFComShares, and those questions will come through, and we'll be working our way through the questions we get. So we've had a couple more come in, Dave. Probably worth it's almost a little back step in. Someone's asked what's the difference between community shares to normal shares, and that'll cover some of the other questions that we've had asked as well.
Okay, there are two aspects to this question, and I'll try and keep it as high level and as untechnical and as unboring as I can, but inevitably I fear I might lose some of you, but we'll do our best, so buckle up. The first difference is about how community shares work in terms of the investment and the community energy project. And the second aspect relates to the regulatory position. So the first aspect, a normal share is often has several features to it. It will usually be transferable. So if I buy a share in a specific company, I can then sell those shares to somebody else. And although I came to your enterprise and I was a big believer, I can basically sell those to anybody else I can find who's gullible enough to take them off me at the price I wish for them. Now that will hopefully be more than I paid for them. That's where I get my return in some respects. But it may be that I'm just trying to cut my losses. You can restrict whether people in normal shares can sell their shares on and give the board what are called preemption rights. So you can block a transfer to somebody else. But that tends to have an impact upon the sort of viability of your offer, because you're restricting the exit routes. You're paid back for your shares through a variety of ways. You can either be paid dividends, which are a percentage of the profit the company has made, proportional to your share ownership. So you might own 20% of the shares in the company, you'll get 20% of the profit. And it's proportional to how much of the company you own. Or you might have what are called preference shares, which are to be redeemed, essentially bought back by the company at a certain rate at a certain time, and it might be over a number of years. In many respects, community share issues have some features which are very similar in practice to those, but there are some subtle and important differences. So if I own 20% of your community energy company and it's a normal company with normal shares, I get 20% of the votes for the board of directors. With community shares, I'm not able to do that. It's one member, one vote. So think of it more like, no matter how much tax you pay, no matter what band your house is in council tax, you still get one vote for the local councillors. Whereas in a company, you'd get more of votes depending on how big your house was. So that alerts us to the fact that we're in something subtly different to a normal company. This is as much a political community with a small p as it is an economic one full of investors looking to achieve something. And so unlike a standard share issue, the number of my influence over the business is limited. The second aspect of community shares, which differs from the traditional share, is that in a community benefit society, they can't distribute profit to their members. So they can't say, we've had a fantastic year, we've made £10,000, let's distribute that to our shareholders in proportion to their shareholding. They're not allowed to distribute surplus at all. All of that money gets applied for the objects for which they're created. However, what they can do is have costs of capital. So what you would do with a community benefit society is not say, we propose to pay you a certain amount based on how much we've made that year. You'd have an aspiration to enable people to withdraw their shares, and in the meantime, whilst they're in the society, they'd earn interest. Think of it like a bank account as much as a share purchase. So you put money into a bank and it earns interest whilst it's the bank have got the use of it, and you can withdraw it at any point. If it's a long-term savings account, you might have to give 6 months or 12 months notice. Community shares work much more like that bank account on long-term access than they do traditional shares. And even though it's not a surplus distribution, any organization is able to pay the cost of its capital. So even a charity can pay interest on any debts it owes to a bank, which it might have borrowed. And the same is true of a community share, community benefit society. They're able to say that it's a legitimate use of our funds to pay back our investors the costs of borrowing their capital, essentially, of using their money to achieve our goals. Unlike a share dividend in a company where you work out what your costs are and what you've got left at the end of the year, declare your profit and distribute that proportionately. Community share interest and withdrawal is classed as an above the line expense. So essentially, before you get to declare your surplus, you include the costs of essentially it's not quite repaying, but enabling your investors to get their return. So in the same way that you would with a bank loan, you declare the costs of repaying your bank loan as a cost of doing business, and then your surplus is after all of those expenses have been taken out. So that those are the two critical differences in terms of how you get your money back and how you get it out, and your rights over the enterprise. The other big difference is that those two things combined create what's called the exemption from the financial promotions regulation. So a normal company offering shares or debt to the public has to have all communications with its potential investors vetted by a regulated person, who's someone who's accredited by the Financial Conduct Authority to be able to verify the accuracy of the statements made to their investors. This is what's at the bottom of any debt product you might take out, or any personal equity plan or pension, or indeed share offer, which is advertised to the public. These are significant costs, because the people who do this signing off, it's not cheap. And it will cost you, if you're doing it offline, it will cost you a significant amount. And this is there to protect ordinary people from essentially unsuitable investments where their capital is at risk, and they need to go in with their eyes open and be aware of all of the ups and downs, and the value of your investment may go down as well as up. So all of these protections which are put in place for consumers apply to a normal share issue. For community shares, though, they're exempt. So if you're doing a share offer, or indeed a debt offer in a community benefit society, you don't need that regulatory sign-off for all of your communications. You still need the offer to be contractually true. So everything is bound by the law of contract. So all of your statements need to be true, or you could be guilty of misrepresentation. But you don't need to get essentially an investment banker or a broker to sign off on every statement you make, and that makes it significantly cheaper to use the advice. So realistically, aside from the costs of using a platform like Crowdfunder, the costs of developing your offer and getting it in front of ordinary people to invest could be less than £10,000, often less than £5,000. Whereas if you were doing that offline in a normal company, it would cost you the best part of £100,000. And then also there's some regulations about how much capital you need to have deployed in, you need to have shown how much skin you've got in the game as directors. That's not the case with a community share issue. So it's much cheaper because it's not got the same regulatory apparatus behind it. It's one member, one vote. And the surplus is not distributable, and it's a cost of capital. And those are the three core differences between a normal share issue and a community share issue. I hope you're still there with us. Apologies for the length of it. Trying to keep it as high level as possible.
I think just to sum that up, was one of the things that's important, and particularly for community shares, is that because it's not regulated, the people who invest do their own due diligence and decide to invest in that offer. So it's important that you are very clear in what you're trying to achieve and how you interact with those people and pass it on. As Dave said, it's one member, one vote. And also, we've had a question which links in quite nicely to this, is can I sell my shares on? And as Dave's alluded to there, it's not as simple as with a regular share offer in a company on the stock market, where I can sell my shares to who I want when I want. You've got to only can sell those unlock the shares with the agreement of the board. Dave, I'm sure you've probably got a more technical way of saying that. But
yeah, the shares which are anything which is transferable, what's called a transferable debt equity instrument is not exempt from those regulations. So if, whilst the Community Benefit Society can issue transferable shares which investors could sell, if you did that as a community energy project, you'd be opening yourselves up to needing to get every publication and every communication and every tweet and every Facebook post signed off as a regulated activity. So the way in which you get repaid through community energy traditionally is through a regular series of withdrawals. So what the majority of projects I've seen and worked on, you might have a solar array which has a life guarantee use of 20 years. And over the course of 20 years, each year after the first 3 years, everybody gets between 5 and 6% of their capital repaid with interest. So that by the end of the 20 years, they've had all of their money back. And it works in financial terms much more like some kind of bond over 20 years. So you invest, I don't know, £500, and at the end of the 20 years, if all goes to plan and the solar generates what it's supposed to, you'd get back maybe twice as much as you invested. So people can start to use it as part of their long-term wealth management. But there are other ways in which you can be repaid. So many societies move on to what are called open offers, where they say to people in their community, you didn't live here when we had a share offer to create the wind turbine in the farm over the road. If you want to be part of the ownership group for this wind turbine, you can now invest on the same terms as everybody else. And because this is new capital, you can use that to essentially repay some of the original people and give them their money. So it works on a one out, one in basis, like a very good nightclub.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Dave. We've had another question come in around a business plan and how long, well, obviously how important is it, which we've already said is very important, but primarily how long do we need to show that plan for and evidence that the financial basis that I'm making these assumptions?
I mean, it's in community energy, you tend to be able to be much more predictable about energy yields from the technology you're deploying and the regulatory framework in which that energy will be utilized. You'll often have contracts with, say, a school or the building in which you're actually installing the solar, for example, which have long-term guarantees about how much money will be paid. So it tends to be possible to do quite detailed and accurate 20-year forecasts, because there isn't that much variability. You know, there's a certain amount of energy which will be generated, and there's certain customers for that energy, and they'll pay a certain price. If you're not in the energy field, or it's a bit riskier, my instinct is that after 4 or 5 years, it starts to become wishful thinking as much as accurate business planning, because unless you can absolutely guarantee that the input in terms of your product and the output in terms of your sales are guaranteed or as near as damn it, then you're getting into the realm of speculation. Energy is very different because it tends to have exactly both of those things. Geothermal is a little different because generally the first stage of the project is much more risky and you've got no real idea of what the yields might be at that stage, but there might be a secondary offer in which you will have greater certainty. But in general, you need to be as detailed as you need to be in order to convince your investors that the aspiration you're making about how likely it is to return money to them can be, why are you so confident that you can get us our money back in 20 years? If you're saying that, you need to show you're working, and depending on the sector you're in, your working will be a lot more detailed than others. But in general, it needs to be as long as it needs to be to demonstrate that you're not making it up as you go along, and that people can invest their money with confidence with you, that essentially you know what you're doing and you've got it all worked out. If you're going for something like this community shares unit standard, Mark, you'll probably need, there's a certain degree of formulaic elements to a business plan which are required in general, which you can see on the community shares units website. But in general, it tends to be much more contextual. You can only be as detailed as you can be, depending on your sector. So if you're running a pub, very different ability to project what you'll be doing in 5 years than if you're running a solar array.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Again, just to point out any questions. If you want to use the hashtag CFComShares, that will bring any questions through to us. We've had one through, which is particularly relevant at the moment, a question around if all community shares come with EIS tax relief. Dave, I know this is something that you're an expert on.
In essence, not anymore. There is a legal challenge which is on Crowdfunder at the moment by Community Energy England to get a judicial review of the government's policy announced in haste last December to remove electricity generation from being eligible for any form of tax relief whatsoever. But if that doesn't succeed, then the only relief which will be available will be towards heat generation rather than electricity generation. If you're in the business of geothermal or biomass, then you could be eligible for one of three different reliefs. One is Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme relief, which is 50% of the investment to be paid back to the investor, up to a maximum of £150,000 per enterprise. This is particularly useful for those projects where there is a development element of risk. So a lot of wind projects used this to raise funds when they didn't know until they get planning permission whether they could even go ahead, and it was a 1 in 2 chance whether you get planning permission or not. So you need to give investors something meaty back, and this was the 50% tax break. That after the 150,000 has been used, you move into Enterprise Investment Scheme relief, which is 30% of what your investors have put in, up to a maximum of £5 million. Though there are some other little rules in place around that. It will be too boring and distracting to go into those because they're very specific. The other tax break which is available is Social Investment Tax Relief, which is the new kid on the block, which is at the moment capped at around £250,000 of investment, and like EIS, offers the ability to give investors 30% tax relief. It's hoped that that SITR relief will be raised to around £5 million. If you're eligible for EIS, you probably would want to use that one in the first instance because it's you're able to raise much more. But SITR has got some subtle differences to what it's eligible for, which I don't think matter as much for community energy, but do for other sectors of community businesses. So yes, you are eligible, but only if you're not in the business of generating electricity for sale back to the grid, or indeed in general. Heat is a different matter.
Okay, so yeah, obviously that's something that's changing a lot within the energy space. I'm sure those of you watching will be aware of all the recent changes around feed-in tariff and things that will play a part in the return that you can potentially offer, or the detail of your offer you've got. So we've had one more question, which is looking at around that. So how important is a return on investment in community, or interest in a community share? That's going to be a changing target at the moment, I imagine, Dave, based on obviously energy projects primarily having quite strong returns.
Yeah, there's been a sort of boon in the last few years where, with the feed-in tariff guaranteeing some pretty meaty prices for energy and getting a tax break on top, community energy was able to offer quite significant and attractive rates of interest. So some of them were pushing 10%, and some even a few north of that. And so it's going to be very difficult to offer those in the current climate where you're not able to offer the tax break and not able to offer the feed-in tariff. That said, I think there's the context for this is that the savings market in the UK for cash savings is both enormous, circa £1.2 trillion. That will take you 32,000 years to count to 1.2 trillion. And most of that is sub 1% investment. So it's not doing very much in a cash ISA for a lot of people. So yes, 10% is probably out with what could be done in the current immediate future, unless there's some revolutionary change to the business models behind community energy. But it strikes me as still possible to get north of 1%. And the community energy promise is actually a really good one. Would you like to not lose the money you've invested and make the world a better place for you, your children and grandchildren, and indeed all of us? There aren't a huge number of people who wouldn't be interested, I think, in making the world a better place and not losing their cash, and maybe making a little bit more cash than they would otherwise, with the ethical sheen that, you know, no beagles were made to smoke in the return of this 2% to you, as the banks can't promise that they will, you know, unless you're investing in a bona fide ethical bank or building society. So I think the underpinning all community share offers is really because of this weirdness about one member, one vote, this weirdness about not being able to sell it on to somebody else for a financial return. At its heart has always been as much a social investment for a social return. In other words, you're making the world a better place and you're using your money to work harder to make that world a better place more quickly than it otherwise would be. That argument still applies. And yes, there will be some people who are not as interested in community energy as they were, but there will still be people, I'm convinced, are going to be interested in community energy, as long as you can get it to the stage where you can say to those investors, we can't get you as much as we used to be able to, but we can still do better than your cash ISA's doing at the bank. Then I think there's an argument there for people to get on board with it, because the rest of it still stacks up. The energy yields still stack up. If you can find a client like a school or a council or somebody else who's prepared to sign a 20-year or 15-year contract to guarantee energy prices, then that's still doable. And I think it's the values which animated community energy, as they do community shares in general, are still out there. They're still being deployed by people who want to make the world a better place and are in the lucky position of having a little bit more money to help make that happen than maybe the average Josephine does.
Okay, and I think, trying to end on a positive note, I think we've had one more question in, and it seems like quite a logical place to end and end positively. Is an example of a successful community shares energy project, a sort of example of good practice? Is there anyone that jumps out to you, Dave, that you've worked with?
The only ones I've seen through to fruition in recent months have been the Made Energy scheme at Maidenhead, where they were up against what's the word, the problem of the end to the feed-in tariff. They've just gone and done this. They're starting their second share issue, which is for another installation. But you know, the other thing to say about community energy is it's responsible for the biggest community share offer in the country, which was Baywind's Community Benefit Society offer, which I think raised about £4 million. Which is by far and away the biggest community energy community share project in the country. And indeed, if you look at the community shares units review of what's been happening in the community shares world, community energy is responsible for by far the largest share, partly because the returns have been the best in the sector. So if you're running a football club, you know, good luck in seeing getting money back to the people who've invested. Pub, much more risky. Energy, much more able in previous times, able to generate returns and make very solid promises to their investors. So I think that's going to change. So a lot of those offers are not are not able to be replicated, but in terms of the groundwork and the depth of detail for business plans and for offer documents, then I think they're very still much there's still a lot to be said from aping those and using them as good examples. It's just, I think, going back to where we came in an era of much lower returns, which are able to be promised because of the changes to the regulatory and tax environment, the community energy is much, much more important, because what's really going to get people to invest isn't you'd be a fool not to, you know, do you like to make money or not? It's going to be much more of all the things people like you can do with your money. This is the thing which is going to do the most to make the world a better place. And we can start that tomorrow. that argument needs to be made sort of almost in hand-to-hand combat, as opposed to an air war. It's up close and personal. It's about how many people can you speak to, how many doors can you leaflet, and how many events can you hold to engage people. So I think in this new era for community energy, engagement becomes much the most important thing than perhaps it traditionally has been, where the returns have often enabled people to, you know, they've sold the offers very nicely because they've been so attractive, and I think it's going to come, the offers which are successful in the new era, assuming Community Energy England are not successful with their judicial review, which hopefully they will be, in which case, you know, we go back to where we were. But if they're not successful and the policy stays as it is, then it's going to come down to who's made the best argument to the most number of people about how this project changes not just the world, but also the community directly in which the energy project is operating.
And I think from the perspective of having worked with quite a few community energy groups myself, is that the community share offer and that engagement of the local community is going to become even more important from a planning perspective as well, and the ability to engage your crowd, to inform them about what you're doing, as well as offering that right to buy into this, will be key as we move forward in this space. As Dave said a couple of times, you know, we're in a little bit of uncharted territory, but there are a lot of strong foundations we can build upon as we move forward in regards to community energy.
Absolutely.
So I think that seems like a logical place to draw it to a close. We haven't had any more questions in since that last one. Thank you to Dave. Thank you also to our partners in this, Steve and Scown, who have produced a FAQs document that we'll share along with a link to this video. And also a link to a previous webinar that Dave and Phil Geraghty, our Managing Director of Crowdfunder, did around the basics of community shares and the key things to consider. And as always, there's lots of information on Community Shares Unit website, Crowdfunder, as well as Dave's Community Share Company website. Lots of key information there to help you on your journey. But most importantly, don't hesitate to get in touch if you've got any questions. Even after this, we'll continue to share information.
Thanks, everybody. Cheers.
Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.
Bye-bye now.